It probably comes as no surprise that Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles from 1990 is my favorite Ninja Turtles movie. I think most Ninja Turtle fans would agree. But it's not just my favorite Ninja Turtles movie. Hell, it's not even just my favorite comic book or superhero-like movie. I consider this movie to be my number 5 favorite movie of all time. That's right, the Big Five. I've probably mentioned most of these on the channel before, but number 1 is the original Rocky, number 2 is the original Halloween, number 3 is The Little Mermaid, or, well, by next year we'll have to say the original Little Mermaid. Number 4 is a cheat where I say the entire Universal Monsters library, as I can't choose a favorite among them and I prefer them as a collection, but then yeah. Number 5 is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Saying this movie was a big deal for me when it came out is an understatement. This was really the first time a franchise I loved was adapted into a major motion picture. Sure, there was Masters of the Universe, but while I loved the Motu brand, it was still a hand-me-down brand from my older brother. He had collected all the toys himself, and the cartoon was in reruns. I was born in '86, so I came in at the tail end of it. Still an important part of my early childhood, but again, it was because of my brother that I had exposure to it. I was personally gifted some Thundercats and Silverhawks figures when very little, but my older siblings were already into said franchises, thus why I was into them. But Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles didn't start with my siblings. I just received the Leonardo figure by Playmates for my 3rd birthday in '89, thought it was the coolest thing ever, and fell in love with the franchise because of that. My older brother did comment when I opened the gift that Ninja Turtles was the hot new thing everyone loved, but it was a much more personal start for a franchise for me than having it grandfathered in by older siblings. Immediately after that, my brother and I got obsessed and watched the cartoon whenever we could and collected the toys we could for years to come. It very quickly became my favorite IP. So when not even a year later a big live-action movie was announced, which I can't actually believe in retrospect was that little time, we were naturally super hyped. We saw it in theaters in spring of 1990 and absolutely loved it. Months later, after we moved into our new house, which would be my home for the next 13 years, we got the VHS tape. I believe it was for Christmas, but perhaps it was for a birthday or something. But regardless, we then owned the film in that classic black slipcover with that unforgettable Pizza Hut baseball commercial, and we watched the hell out of it. I actually still own the same copy, making it the oldest childhood movie I still own today. I recall rewatching the tape all the time, in the morning, at night. There were so many times that tape played in our living room. Most adaptations at the time, and for years after it, were expected to stray greatly from the source material. Most films based on cartoons, comics, video games, or toys in the 80s and 90s were heavily reworked in an attempt to broaden the appeal outside of their small built-in fan bases. But New Line Cinema's Ninja Turtles stayed shockingly true to the source material. While I wasn't aware of how insanely close they kept it to the Mirage comics as a kid, it was shocking to see all 4 Turtles, Splinter, Shredder, April O'Neil, and Casey Jones, all present and, for the most part, very well represented. The origin story was generally kept intact from the original comics, save the bit about Shredder being the brother of the original arrival of Hamato Yoshi, which I'm glad they changed because I never liked that part from the comics anyway. The Turtles' designs were spot on, their origin was spot on, their lair was spot on, the way they talked was spot on, the pizza eating was spot on, and their personalities were spot on, albeit more evolved and, for lack of a better word, realistic versions of their cartoon show counterparts. Sure, there were differences in the movie, no Krang, Rocksteady, or Bebop, though that was not too shocking. I think most of us fans were expecting the first film to stay simpler before diving off the deep end into Dimension X and all the other mutant characters. And there were other differences, like April not working for Byrne Thompson, nor with any of the other Channel 6 gang we all knew from the cartoon, but those were all small acceptable changes. The fact they got the 4 brothers, their sensei, and their foe so perfectly, it made most minute changes unnoticeable. The New York City and sewer setting were greatly realized and portrayed too. Almost everything as far as keeping up appearances was a 10 out of 10. The only characters who look a bit more off from what kids knew at the time were the humans. Judith Hoag was an amazing April O'Neil, but visually it was a strange adjustment for us at the time. She really didn't resemble the character we knew at all. I always found it funny how much the Turtles thirst for her, constantly calling her a babe and kissing her on the TV screen. I'm not saying Judith isn't a very pretty woman, but she isn't particularly done up to look sexy in the film. Not that she has to, but their reactions imply she's meant to be. She's wearing ultra casual, not sexy clothes and almost no makeup. Though I guess if you were a teenage boy who has been living underground and have never been in the same room as a girl before, and now there's one in your home, it'd probably be a pretty exciting experience. But her design is slightly reminiscent of the comic one. Not so much her design in the earlier issues, but after a few issues in, where she got the perm haircut and all. Though the red hair and brief moment early on where she's wearing bright yellow are clearly meant to mimic the cartoon. Casey Jones is pretty perfect visually, except he's not nearly as buff as Jones traditionally is. My friend and I always laugh confused at the line, "It's Wayne Gretzky on steroids," saying how Wayne Gretzky could likely snap him like a twig, even though he's not exactly the biggest hockey player either. I can only assume the steroids part was implying his rage rather than size, but I think for most of us fans, this became the definitive Casey. Even most adaptations in the future, like the 2003 cartoon and 2007 animated film, would give Casey the long hair and a similar personality to the one in this version. But enough about the supporting heroes. While we're on the topic of characters, let's talk about our main green teens. I don't have to think twice before saying I think this film has the single greatest representation of the Ninja Turtles. All of their personalities are on point and are all relatable. Leonardo isn't just portrayed as a leader who does everything right. Since he is just a teenager, he still has doubts about his leadership and has emotional outbursts, mostly in response to Raph. He wants so bad to obey and respect Splinter any way he can. He lets himself get frustrated at his brother's differences, which ultimately becomes a weakness for him. Seeing how heated he and Raph get with each other when they're arguing, going to the point of Leo telling him to go away and "who needs you," which genuinely hurts watching as a kid who wants to see the brothers get along, to then seeing how emotionally destroyed he is when Raph is in a coma, that he can't even leave his side and just sits crying, waiting for his brother to show signs of health again, is extremely touching for a movie that didn't have to go to such places. All this movie was expected to do was be a big dumb action comedy for kids, but they took the time and effort to really flesh out the characters and make it something powerful and relatable for kids watching it. No one ever wants to live with the fear and regret of never being able to tell a loved one how much you care about them, especially when the last thing you ever said to them was something out of anger towards them. In this case, that thing he said being what made Raph leave and ultimately end up unconscious in the first place. Leo learns from this moment to stop putting himself above others in an attempt to be the leader he thinks Splinter expects him to be, and rather learns to love and accept his family's differences and grow together with them. A good leader understands his team and helps them to work together, not drive them away. Michelangelo did have quite a bit of his arc cut from the later parts of the film, mostly at the farmhouse, but he's still handled incredibly well. Mike is often portrayed as the biggest goofball of the team and the one least serious about his training. In this movie, they take it in a more realistic direction. Sure, Mikey is the most jokey of the bunch, but he also uses his humor to mask his insecurities. Again, he's just a teenager, so he's still immature and learning. When Donatello is talking with him in the famous "Pizza Dude's got 30 seconds" scene, he asks Mike a serious question about how the four of them, just teens outside of society, will manage to get by when Splinter passes. The thought of such frightening changes and his dad passing away scare Mike too much to acknowledge. He ignores Don and keeps joking around, but it's clear by his pauses and even how he refuses to look at Don directly in the eye that it truly bothers and scares him. Like many kids who have never had to deal with major deaths in a family and giant lifestyle changes before, it scares him to the point of denial. He tries to protect himself from reality with his humor. He's essentially afraid to grow up. But then when Splinter appears in the vision to them at the farmhouse to let them know he's still alive, Mikey is the only one physically crying afterwards. Based on the comic adaptation of the film and sketches we've seen, the scenes that were cut presumably would have had Mike getting very serious about training while Splinter was presumed dead and Raph was in a coma, in a very dark and angry place, which only further adds to this arc. Mikey stays silly and optimistic, but he ultimately uses it to spread happiness and morale rather than shield himself by the end of the movie. Donatello is definitely a bit more subtle than the others in the film, but when you really look at him, I feel they did a fantastic job. He's not building interdimensional portals out of TV sets or molecular altering ray guns out of microwaves, but his intellect and overall maturity is displayed often in the film. The fact he is the only turtle to be able to ask questions such as what happens when Splinter passes away, and as level-headed as he does, shows he is likely smarter than his brothers. He's always thinking more, thus making him more comfortable with a lot of ideas and topics that the others are afraid of. He also shows his maturity in that he never gives into arguing and rather just tries to calm down his brothers when they're angry or upset. He puts a hand on Raph's shoulder when he's angry at the beginning, only for venting Raph to try to start physically fighting him. And he also comforts Mikey with a hand on his shoulder when he's crying for Splinter later on. Donnie tells a ton of jokes in the movie. All of the turtles told jokes in the cartoon, so it wasn't shocking, but seeing how much more Don and Mike joke than the other two in the movie, I guess it can stand out as weird to some. I've heard people suggest it was simply because Donnie was voiced by Corey Feldman, a popular young actor at the time, who had been funny in quite a few other movies like The Lost Boys and The Burbs, but I like to think it was more an intentional character choice. Donnie's humor comes off more like he is more humble than the other turtles. He likes to make light of things to keep the team in good spirits, as is usual for members of a group who know more than the rest. They have no reason to act intellectually above their teammates, as they just are intellectually above them. Donnie's inventor side was really only hinted at with he and Casey restoring the truck together, but I feel it was clearly there for that reason, and was such an iconic scene, they actually showed it on the side of the VHS sleeve. Raphael was definitely treated like the main character of the film, though I feel all the turtles got a good amount of time to shine. Unfortunately though, nobody told partners in crime that Raph was not the leader. Raph is the most different from his cartoon counterpart, as rather than being a wisecracking smartmouth, he's an angsty, rebellious teen. Raph came off as unreasonably mean to me as a kid sometimes, but as I got older, I realized the beauty in how relatable they made him to real-life teenagers. He loves his family, he means well, but like many teenagers, he grows impatient and fed up with them. He's sick of being told what he has to do all the time by his father and brother. He's sick of being told he can't go out when he wants to and do the things he'd like to. He wants freedom. He wants the ability to live a normal life and not hide in the sewers. He feels he's being held down and smothered by his family and accidentally vents his anger with them in the worst ways. He beats himself up over every little mistake, but blames Leo whenever he can. Like with the other turtles, he learns over the course of the film that his family isn't smothering him or holding him back. They're simply doing what they can for him because they care about him so much. Raph's denial to stay in the shadows like his brothers proves to be difficult for his family, but also helpful. For example, if Raph had never gone out about the town, the team never would have met Casey, who ended up helping them immensely in the long run. It's a good way of showing that while teenagers do need to get over the uncontrollable angst and pent-up anger they might have, families do also need to give them their freedom when they need it. Trying to overly control a child during a difficult time in their life can sometimes lead to bad things, and just letting them be their own people and learn from their own experiences can end up being very good for them. So simply put, the Turtles are handled amazingly well. And even though I just described them like this is some reptilian soap opera, they still have all the slapstick shenanigans, goofy jokes, and radical one-liners you'd expect as a fan of the cartoon. The movie's so great with its characters because it can so seamlessly work in such amazing, relatable traits and arcs, while also not being too dark. It constantly maintains the silliness of the cartoon, just in a much more mature and realistic world. I see this movie as the perfect blend of the original Mirage comics and the 1987 Fred Wolf animated series. It takes most of the plot elements and scenes from the comics, as well as some of the darker and more threatening aspects, and mixes it with the jokes, personalities, colors, and attitudes of the cartoon. They knew what to pull more inspiration from the cartoon for, and they knew what to pull more inspiration from the comics for. Shredder is a case where they almost completely pulled from the comic. Gone is the whiny, pathetic goofball from the cartoon. Shredder in this movie is an absolute badass. He was genuinely scary as a kid, and his intro scene to the rest of the Foot Clan is honestly expertly shot and chilling. The long, slow silhouette entering the light, leading to him entering the room with a spinning camera and an amazing score as all his minions watch on in awe and respect just perfectly tells you what kind of Shredder this is. He is a force to be reckoned with, almost seemingly inhuman. He's treated like some sort of evil deity. He's not playing around like the cartoon one. He wants revenge on the Hamato clan, and he wants to rule New York with an iron and razor-sharp fist. The only complaint I could have is very minor, and that is that, due to the size of his helmet and the bagginess of his costume, he looks rather scrawny at some points in the movie. I'm not sure how built the actor actually was, he might have been huge, but he appears a bit tiny. I think if they had padded the inside of his outfit slightly, not like big, crazy, stuffed muscle, but just a little bit of padding in the outfit, he could have looked a bit more intimidating. Though again, that's a very minor complaint, and he is plenty intimidating already. When Shredder is on the screen, you feel his presence. He has a commanding and intimidating presence. There were several new characters added like Tatsu and Danny. They're memorable, but not the most necessary additions. And I already mentioned her briefly, but Judith Hoag as April does a great job. There's something about her narrations on the farm I always found particularly well done. She gives a good outside perspective on what is happening to these brothers as their family struggles through such a hard time. Since the Turtles are all in a low point, I think it was wise to put the focus on April's perspective for the situation. Her narration, accompanied by her sketches, gives it this very real feel. It makes the audience feel not only heavily invested in the characters and plot, but also like we too are worn out after an intense series of events, and now we're reflecting back on everything that has happened thus far. It's funny how the farmhouse scenes not only felt like they took hours to get to when watching as a kid, but felt particularly long as well. Now you realize how short it actually is when you watch it. But on that note, I think a lot of that is important. I can see how non-fans could listen to this video and say I'm overanalyzing a dumb kids movie and that it's just a short little thing meant to keep kids entertained and quiet for an hour and a half. But I think that's the beauty of the movie. It deals with serious and emotional moments for kids. It feels like a really long epic for kids. It feels like a glimpse into a bigger, darker world for kids. Seeing this as a kid, which it was primarily intended for, it felt like you were watching a true epic. It's films like this that get children invested in dramatic storytelling and well-written characters. Sure, to an adult it may seem light and simplistic, but for a kid it's heavy stuff. I think this movie, more than any of the other Ninja Turtles movies, really nails the perfect balance. It's a fun, nostalgic, action-packed, and silly ride for adults that we can look at now and respect for its sprinkled in heavier elements, and it's an epic that is fun and entertaining yet also treats you with maturity and respect for kids. All the films after this one, especially in this trilogy, did away with the more dramatic elements. Even though they were subtle, it seems the sequels felt they were too much and instead went for nothing but comedy. After I saw this movie as a kid, the bar had been set high. I couldn't wait to see the sequel. I was so hyped to see things like Rocksteady and Bebop or The Rat King adapted in a slightly darker, more intimidating way. I thought the franchise would keep this tone and only incorporate more and more things I knew and loved from the franchise. It seemed like the sequels were undoubtedly going to get better and better, but sadly they were never able to come close to replicating the greatness of the 1990 flick. Even though I like plenty of other TMNT films, I'd argue this is the only one that is, by all accounts, a good movie, like a sincerely good film all around. But aside from the fact I feel this is truly a good film, a lot of my love for it, of course, does come from nostalgia. This was just such a key part of my childhood. The fantastic synth score of the film is iconic for that point in time. The look of the movie is spot on. Siskel and Ebert absolutely hated this movie, calling it nothing but a violent MTV film. And while I respectfully disagree, calling it an MTV movie isn't unwarranted. Everything from skateboarding, pizza eating, silly rap music, synth music, California surfer lingo, and making comedy of everything were all key parts of the MTV generation of the 80s. The 1980s had just come to a close, and this movie was almost a celebration, a time capsule of sorts, of everything that was cool and hip with the young generations at the turn of the decade. If someone wanted to know what kids thought was cool in 1990, all you'd have to do is show them this movie. While Secret of the Ooze is also extremely nostalgic, no Turtles movie stands out in my mind as much as a cherished childhood memory as this movie does. It helped me broaden my love for the Turtles IP immensely, and even helped me broaden my appreciation of film as a whole. I recall rewatching it in 1999 after years of not seeing it, expecting it to be way worse than I remembered, but being very pleasantly surprised at what a great movie it was. Again in high school around 2004, the same thing. Every time I revisited this movie, expecting myself to have finally grown past thinking it's amazing, I always find myself still thinking it's amazing, and finding even more to respect about it. It truly is a masterpiece in my mind. Sure, it may not be one of the all-time film greats for most, but for what it was supposed to be, and what it was expected to be, it went above and beyond. It truly is a masterpiece, and I will always love it. Do all the liking and subscribing and the sharing and the bell stuff.